Just take a picture outside. Do you want to and then, oh, they are already inside, so the people are waiting until the end.
حلوة أوي صح؟
Hello, good morning. Can we please take our seats? Thank you everyone for taking your seats. Thank you so much. All right, okay. Thank you everyone so much for being here. Welcome. We're going to do some quick housekeeping notes. So this event is live streamed. It will be hybrid and delivered in English, interpreted in French and Spanish. And we encourage you to tweet using the hashtag #ClimateSRHR. Good morning from COP27. This is taking place in Sharm el-Sheikh here in Egypt. I am Sophia Lee. I am a Chinese American journalist and environmental advocate. It is my absolute pleasure to moderate this incredible event that has been jointly organized by the United Nations Population Fund, the UNDP, and the OHCHR with the generous support of IDRC Canada. Thank you for joining us today to discuss enhancing climate action through integrated rights-based and gender-responsive approaches in the context of the climate crisis. Today's session builds on the important work of our co-conveners and other key partners. Friends, we are here today because we know that the growing pace and scale of the climate crisis continues to negatively impact the health and well-being of women and girls. The evidence is growing, as is the disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable women and girls on the frontline communities. This growing urgency around these issues makes our conversation today both timely and strategic. As we look to make progress on implementing gender-responsive climate action through rights-based approaches that also integrate sexual and reproductive health and rights, also known as SRHR, into national climate policies, we must continue to highlight and address existing gaps in implementation, funding, data, and access to ensure that climate adaptation efforts truly leaves no one behind. This COP presents an incredible opportunity to take the next step, both in terms of implementation and the critical financing that will drive that. Our discussion today aims to bring us closer to this desired goal. Ooh, I love all the females in the audience. Represent, yes. Okay, so to get us started, it gives me great pleasure to welcome our distinguished speakers. We have seen that climate-related emergencies exacerbate existing health vulnerabilities and gender inequalities. They create conditions of insecurity that contribute to rising to some harmful practices, including gender-based violence. And it is clear that we must move forward together as a global community to adapt and build resilience to climate impacts through gender-responsive and rights-based approaches. Finland has been a global leader in equality and inclusion, supporting the global goals on these fronts to address impact, especially on vulnerable communities. Your Excellency H.E. Hanna Sarkkinen, Minister of Social Affairs and Health, Finland is a champion of equality and inclusion. Earlier in the year at a multi-stakeholder forum, you highlighted the importance of systematic gender mainstreaming across all policies related to the 2030 agenda. Excellency, we are grateful for your leadership and your presence here today, and we look forward to your opening remarks. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much and good afternoon for everybody. Dear Chair and distinguished partners, I would like firstly to thank Egypt for hosting us here in the African continent, where many of the impact of the climate change are felt most dramatically. I would like to also thank UNFPA for inviting me to this event. UNFPA is a very important partner for the government of Finland. Finland has more than doubled its funding to the UNFPA during the past few years of our government. Dear friends, climate change is a social question. The transition to the zero-emission societies must be socially fair. Climate change is also a gender issue. Gender inequality diminishes access to resources, services, information and decision-making needed to adapt to the climate crisis. We have to increase our efforts to ensure a gender perspective in all climate, environment and disaster management policies. Finland emphasizes the importance of gender transformative climate action. Climate adaptation needs to be based on gender analysis. Dear friends, Finland undertook recently a gender impact assessment on our climate and energy strategy. Sex disaggregated data show that men in general have a larger carbon footprint as car-centered mobility and meat consumption are dominating masculine norms, while women's mobility is characterized by walking and bus riding. Some jobs, especially those related to fossil fuels, will be lost due to the climate policy measures in the male-dominated sectors of energy, transport, agriculture and construction. Still, the overall impact of climate policy measures will be positive for men, as the new green jobs are mostly created in the male-dominated sectors. The proposed policy measures will have a negative impact also on female-dominated fields, such as care and consumer services, tourism and restaurant services. The study found that gender-blind climate action risks cementing the gender-segregated labor market, as well as the Nordic gender pay gap. Men and boys make the majority in science, technology and mathematics educations and consequently dominate the sectors of the green new economy. Education of girls and training of women in sectors that benefit from climate policy measures should therefore be considered, as the study showed us. Dear friends, to be fair, we have to recognize that women's unpaid care work burden is still making it very difficult for girls and women to take the time and enter into the new climate-related jobs in technical sectors. Therefore, the formalization of childcare is a climate policy issue. The more equal division of care responsibilities between the fathers and mothers within families is also a climate policy issue. Our societies and economies will gain if they can tap into the talents of girls and women as much as men and boys. But unwritten social norms still dictate that women still often have the sole responsibility to care for children, the food, the water, the elderly, etc. The availability of reliable childcare services, decent parental leaves and good sexual and reproductive health services, and the full realization of the sexual and reproductive rights, fighting harmful norms and sexual harassment can make it possible for millions of women to participate meaningfully as workers, experts and leaders in the new climate policy sectors of our societies and economies. Dear friends, I would particularly want to highlight the intersection between climate issues and sexual and reproductive health and rights. Universal access to quality comprehensive sexuality education, family planning and maternity services, sanitation and access to modern contraception is essential to the fulfillment of rights of all women and girls. Bodily autonomy and freedom from all forms of sexual and gender-based violence are crucial to the participation and decision-making in the society, including in climate action. Finland's two key development policy priorities are gender and climate, and gender includes sexual and reproductive health and rights. Our effort to mainstream gender equality and climate action in all development and foreign policy will hopefully pave the way for engaging girls and women in all of their intersecting identities. We want to pay special attention to women and girls in vulnerable situations, especially women and girls with disabilities. But thank you for the opportunity to open this very important session, and I wish you the most important and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. So COP26 saw a lot of commitment on multiple fronts. The Egypt presidency of COP27 has promised to deliver a COP of implementation where all stakeholders make good on their commitments. We are 3 days away from the official close of COP27, and we must move the needle on the intersectionality between gender, SRHR, and climate action. Today, yes, today we have the opportunity to hear firsthand from our esteemed speaker from Zimbabwe, H.E. Barbara Radzi, Honorary Deputy Minister of Environment, Climate, Tourism, and Hospitality Industry. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm not sure. Good morning. It's still morning. Director of Ceremonies, Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I am very excited to be in front of you this morning, more so in front of many women in the room. The gender issue is a topical issue that makes me excited and gives me a lot of energy. The topic is also amazing. What gives us resilience, what makes a woman amazing is the resilience that we have, the resilience in women, and what affects many people within the context of climate change is more on the women. Everything comes on us. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, it is great pleasure to be a part of this esteemed event as we collectively advance the inclusion of gender, sexual and reproductive health and rights within the climate change discourse. Indeed, this comes as a very opportune time to discuss these issues as the impacts of climate change are threatening gender, sexual, reproductive health and rights, especially in developing countries. In developing countries such as the country Zimbabwe, where I come from, the impact of climate change on gender may not be overemphasized. In fact, climate change impacts are not gender neutral, with women and girls bearing the brunt more than male counterparts. Women and girls face particular vulnerabilities resulting from cultural norms and lower socioeconomic status in the society. Women and girls are vulnerable in this way because of the cultural practices and gender stereotypes that keep them in an equal power relationship with men within their families and communities. It is like that in Africa. Women are less powerful than men, and it makes women more vulnerable. Their domestic roles often make them disproportionate users of natural resources such as water, firewood, forestry products. This is notwithstanding the vagaries associated with weather extremes such as droughts, tropical cyclones, and flooding, which demands infrastructure, hospitals, roads, thereby reducing their mobility and curtail to access the basic human rights and services. Distinguished colleagues, in Zimbabwe, women constitute more than 70% of smallholder farmers relying on dryland agriculture for survival. The challenge is on how to ensure a pronounced inclusion of sexual health and reproductive rights within the context of building resilience towards leaving no one behind and no place behind. It is imperative that as the discussions on climate change now recognize these aforementioned rights, countries strive to align these policies to ensure that there is an enabling environment to uphold gender and sexual reproductive health and rights. In Zimbabwe, climate change policies and plans prepared by the government over the years have included gender considerations to varying extents across sectors and ministries. Concerted efforts have been made towards ensuring a gender-responsive national climate policy work frame supported by a climate change gender action plan, which pronounces the need to ensure that the concerns of the women and men are taken into consideration in planning for resilience in a low-carbon trajectory. In addition, the revised nationally determined contributions also bolster on economic-wide approach by building resilience, recognizing gender inclusivity and equity, and also equality in climate change response. Ladies and gentlemen, these efforts have been complemented by the concrete interventions such as the Solar for Health program, which has seen the installation of solar systems at all district clinics in the country towards ensuring enhanced health access for all, which hinges on sexual and reproductive rights, health rights. Section 29 and 76 of our Constitution directs the government to strengthen initiatives to promote and protect women's rights to health. Further, Zimbabwe developed the National Health Strategy, Reproductive Health Policy, and National HIV and AIDS Policy. The main key areas of focus has been to reduce maternal mortality ratio, ensure hygiene, sanitation and other nutritional needs are made for all the attainment of universal access to HIV and AIDS treatment. In addition, under our own devolution, the Zimbabwe government is on a drive to enhance access to safe and clean for drinking through a countrywide presidential borehole drilling program. This is a response program to water shortages as a result of prolonged droughts and rainfall decrease over the years, which has resulted in water crisis over time. As a result of climate change, women and girls queue for long hours to fetch water, and men solicit for sexual favors from them in exchange of water access. You know how it can be to be at a borehole and it's a queue and men are the ones with the power to bring out the water from the borehole, and sometimes women are asked for favors, which result to sex. With the drilling of boreholes, our women and girls will be safe from being exploited or, in extreme case, victims of rape. It is therefore critical that in the global response to climate change, adequate water of the right quality be provided within the reasonable distances from residential areas, and also mechanisms in terms of using technology is also key for the access of water for the women. This will go a long way in upholding the sexual and reproductive health and rights and enhancement of gender mainstreaming in climate change response. In addition, climate smart interventions such as the rollout of improved cook stoves and biogas digesters in rural areas are aiding the issues of promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights, as women are saved from walking longer distances in search of firewood in places that they may potentially be violated as well. These, ladies and gentlemen, also contribute to low emission development as less firewood is required for cooking. As I close, it is important to ensure that we recognize that the impacts of the climate change are not gender neutral, and cultural differences will always stand in the way of promoting sexual and reproductive health and rights within the climate change discourse. I therefore would like to call for enhanced information exchange, collaborations, and partnerships towards strengthening gender, sexual, and reproductive health and rights in the global response to climate change. Let's all work together as a globe. We are in a village that you cannot be on your own. Let's exchange notes, let's exchange information to fight climate change cause. I thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellencies, for drawing the link between climate exacerbation and gender inequality. We know that we have a diverse and engaged audience in the room and online across the globe to help further crystallize the discussion. We would like to play a short 3-minute video that demonstrates the impact of the climate crisis on women and girls and on their sexual reproductive health and rights.
Reproductive health and rights. It is time we build climate-resilient health systems to protect the well-being of all. The global climate crisis is one of the most pressing problems we face. It disrupts development, multiplies people's vulnerabilities, and worsens gender inequality. When a climate disaster hits, livestock and crops are lost. Households and livelihoods are destroyed. Girls may be removed from school and put to work to alleviate their family's financial hardships. A girl out of school is at risk of being married off to a much older man, leaving her vulnerable to intimate partner violence and HIV due to an imbalance of power. Her education and aspirations are ended. Women and girls often lose the ability to manage their reproductive health. Health services like family planning are interrupted and unintended pregnancies rise. No menstrual products and lack of clean water may prevent them from menstruating with dignity. More women die without qualified birth attendants. To reduce shocks during disasters, we must protect the health and well-being of all. Climate adaptation measures need to include strengthening health services, especially sexual and reproductive health. National health plans must include strategies for adapting and building resilience. Better emergency preparedness, response, and recovery is needed to prevent gender-based violence, which frequently accompanies climate emergencies. UNFPA champions gender equality and prevents and responds to gender-based violence. We ensure continuity of services for sexual and reproductive health, including access to safe birth services. We urge governments to include health in their nationally determined contributions, especially sexual and reproductive health, and to secure the resources needed to build resilient communities. Greener and just nations position health, education, and gender in their climate change plans. The time to build forward better is now.
Thank you, Your Excellencies, for your time and commitment to gender and women equality today. I will thank you. Okay. Now, how exactly are we going to address these changes and adapt to the climate crisis in a gender-responsive manner? To further unpack this, we are moving into 3 dynamic fireside chats with an excellent lineup of key stakeholders who I will ask to come up to the stage now. These incredible humans are working hard to advance this agenda globally. The first conversation will address the current state of play, highlighting how the UN system is coming together to address gaps and opportunities. The second fireside chat will engage governments and grassroots actors, while the final chat will speak to the importance of financing, partnerships, and moving this agenda forward on the road to COP28. Thank you in advance to our speakers for sharing short and precise responses. Each chat will involve 2 rounds of questions, with each speaker having about 2 minutes for your response. While the first fireside chat is on gaps and opportunities to address climate impacts to gender equality, including SRHR. While gender is mentioned in the 2015 Paris Agreement, we still need further elaboration and critical action on gender and SRHR linkages to climate adaptation and resilience. In 2018, the IPCC noted that climate change and gender-blind climate change interventions could worsen gender inequality. In February of 2022, the IPCC AR6 Working Group 2 report emphasized this finding with increased evidence of disproportionate impact on women and girls. At COP26, multiple commitments were made by member states to support gender-responsive climate action, including continued implementation of the Gender Action Plan. However, especially with the current world events, so much more remains to be done, and these commitments must be backed up by tangible actions. Today, we will hear insights from leading UN agencies on the important evidence, gaps, and opportunities they are seeing that can really advance this important work. Our first fireside chat today, we have 3 dynamic UN actors in this space. First, we have Ms. Reem Alsalem, United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, its causes and consequences. Welcome. We have Ms. Monica Ferro, Director of the UNFPA Geneva office. Hi, Monica. And Ms. Raquel Lagunas, UNDP Head of Gender. Welcome, Raquel. So, this question goes to Ms. Reem, our Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls. In your latest report to the UN General Assembly, you said, climate change is the most consequential threat multiplier for women and girls, with far-reaching impacts on new and existing forms of gender inequities. Reem, what is the most surprising discovery from your latest report?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you to UNFPA for organizing this side event and also for having me. Perhaps the most surprising element that I found is that even though the data is lacking, still it was possible for me, for this report, to draw the conclusion without a shadow of the doubt that the impact of climate change is undeniably gendered, that women and girls do not only experience the climate crisis in a different way, but that they are also more disproportionately and more severely impacted. Not only that, but that also all aspects of the lives of women and girls have been significantly impacted, including their enjoyment of fundamental human rights. And this is the thing, we have to remember that the climate crisis is a human rights crisis. So basically, in the report, what was very clear is that women and girls' access to effective assistance mechanisms, including social protection, psychological, and as we heard, sexual and reproductive health services have been severely impeded. We also know that in the aftermath of natural disasters, because precisely of the breakdown of law and order and services. That leads to failures in reporting of cases and risks to violence against women and girls, but also breakdowns in referral mechanisms and therefore access to effective protection and assistance. And let's remember, in many of these areas that are affected by the climate crisis, including natural disasters, already the framework and the policies that are in place are already precarious, are already weak, and so then this breakdown really makes things a lot worse. It was also interesting to see, and not surprising unfortunately, that the loss of livelihood forces women and girls in different parts of the world into sexual exploitation in exchange for things as basic as food and also natural resources, including water and fuel. And so, as we heard, the water scarcity from droughts in many parts of the world push women and girls to travel longer distances into unfamiliar areas on their own and usually without safeguards. And I have to say that it's not just state and state actors that can either by omission or by direct responsibility result in violence, but also non-state actors. And I'm thinking in particular of private industries, the extractive industries, who through their activities in different areas of the world have really also created the scope for opportunistic sexual violence with little accountability. So as you can imagine, this leads to really a proliferation of the risk of trafficking for women and girls, family separation, an increase in children that are unaccompanied, and family separation. And one thing that really came across very strongly, if I can just say, is really the role that conflict over land plays in exacerbating the risk of violence for women. There are efforts to force them off their lands, strip them away from their land rights, and in doing so, therefore use the threat or actual experience of violence. Now, we often think of violence as physical violence, but in my report, I also talk about the psychological forms of violence that are exacerbated, like depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, post-traumatic stress disorder. And we should also think actually of reduced privacy that women experience in many of these natural disaster-created centers, that this can create also psychological violence. And of course, also the climate crisis makes household tasks more labor-intensive, leads to a proliferation of violence in homes, including domestic violence, increases unpaid household work, as we heard from the minister just now, and also increases women's economic burden. And of course, the loss of livelihood leads to harmful coping mechanisms like forced marriages, premature withdrawal of girls from education, and so on and so forth. I will close just by saying that some groups of women are particular risk of violence, and we have to really take an intersectional approach, like women environmental human rights defenders, indigenous women, older women, women of diverse sexual orientation, gender identities, women with disabilities, women forcefully displaced, women in poverty, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Reem. Whew, that is, yes. So that is a lot of findings to support this evidence. I have a question now for Ms. Raquel. So the UNDP, through its climate promise, has worked with 110 countries to support integration of gender equality in the NDCs. Raquel, with most of the updated NDCs submitted, what opportunities do you see to further expand this work and advance gender equality in climate action?
So thank you. Thank you so much, and thank you to UNFPA for leading on this event. I wanted to share a little bit the background, the past, so we see the future. When we started working with NDCs and with countries, we found common gaps, including no gender data, gender disaggregated data, including limited understanding of the nexus between climate change and gender equality, environmental ministries and the national machineries kind of not used to work together or very rarely coordinating, and women's and civil organizations definitely not at the table. So we wanted to really commend, first of all, the big effort of many of these countries and governments making progress. So today we are in a very different place. Just to give you an example, 95% of the climate promise countries are integrating gender considerations somehow with different quality or the different dimensions, but at least there are some good news that we need to take as opportunities. UNDP invested in helping to create this governance system, these mechanisms of coordination. We helped also on the planning side. This is another opportunity. We need gender analysis of different sectors, and we need to articulate better, well, the countries and governments, we support this work, articulate better the different climate policy instruments. So if we talk about opportunities, today, 77% of NDCs are including women in the adaptation plans, and 58% under mitigation. And 29% of NDCs are referring to women in decision-making. This is the needle that we need to push. Those are the emphases. There are more data that we can share, but those are some dimensions that today are ready to move from the pledge, from intentions to actions. Just in a nutshell. There are more opportunities, but let's start with that.
Let's start with that. Thank you, Raquel. So, Ms. Monica, the UNFPA has made it clear that climate impacts will make it very hard to achieve its 3 transformative results, including 1, ending preventable maternal deaths, 2, unmet need for family planning, and 3, gender-based violence and harmful practices, which is why there has been an increase in your work with countries on gender adaptation. So as UNFPA is increasing its focus on gender-sensitive adaptation measures that integrate SRHR, what are your findings from your recent review of the NDCs?
Thank you, Sophie. It's a great question, and it follows perfectly what Raquel just announced. I just want to start by saying how honored I feel to share a stage with these 2 amazing women, but also how inspired I was by the statement of the Finnish minister and the Zimbabwean minister. And I think I have almost nothing to add to what you just said, how you articulated the impact of gender, of climate in gender, how you articulated what SRHR was and how it is critical that we address them in climate change, gives us the strength and the inspiration to keep moving forward, knowing that, as you were saying, Minister, it's a village. And as you were saying, Minister, it's a village where women and girls are being impacted disproportionately by climate change. Thank you for that. So I could just wrap up here, but no. We actually did some, I would call it pragmatic, but it's more programmatic work with the NCDs. And so, NDCs, sorry. So we know that climate change affects disproportionately the most vulnerable women and girls in all their intersecting identities, as the Special Rapporteur just highlighted. And we know it has detrimental effects on their health and rights, including on sexual reproductive health and rights, and the right to be free from violence and harmful practices. This is why we say it very clearly, and you'll hear me say this throughout my presentation this morning. True climate justice, it's not possible without gender justice. It's very clear for us, and this is why we took it upon ourselves and we commissioned a study analyzing the NDCs. As you know, the NDCs is the key national, it's the country national policy document, to include, and includes a description on how countries will work to mitigate, adapt, and build resilience to climate change. So we took a look, we did an analysis on 112, and we wanted to see to which extent these documents, so the mapping that countries did on how to reach the goals, to which extent they they addressed issues that we consider essential. So we focused on gender, including gender-based violence, health with a focus on sexual reproductive health and rights, population dynamics, human rights, participation and vulnerable groups, and youth. And you can tell me if you are surprised by our findings. So gender is mentioned in most NDCs. However, most references were not supported with meaningful descriptions of action. We also saw that health is mentioned in almost all NDCs. However, it often excludes specific sexual reproductive health and rights concerns and vulnerabilities. And we know, and we've heard today already, the impacts of climate change directly and indirectly on sexual reproductive health and rights, from a safe delivery to the impact on child marriage, to the access of sexual reproductive health and rights services when you lose livelihoods or when you have a legal barrier. And in humanitarian settings, you can multiply by 10 the challenges. So just to finish, Sophia, we also saw that food and water insecurity is highlighted as a challenge in many regions, yet it doesn't consider the different impact on groups with increased vulnerabilities, such as women and children. Some countries, they refer to conflict-induced human displacement, and many countries do consider refugees as a vulnerable population, yet not all provide concrete measures to increase the resilience of internal displaced people. And let me just give you another example. The vulnerability of youth to climate change is highlighted in some NDCs, and in some cases in relation to health. However, these are mostly descriptions of vulnerabilities. More commitments are needed when it comes to specific measures, initiatives, and costing to address youth vulnerability. So we have many more examples, but this analysis is very critical for what to do next. It's taking stock of what we have, but especially mapping the way forward, and I'll talk to that later on. Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Monica. Reem, I wanted to go back to you and ask, what is the one thing governments and others can do to deliver for women and girls given the growing impacts of climate change? What is the top priority for governments?
The one thing they can do is not to do one thing. And it's very simple. I mean, to be able to do really meaningful, transformative work on this, you have to have a comprehensive approach. It has to include all society, and it has to be long-term, and it has to address underlying causes. So we cannot do or focus on just piecemeal issues that address participation or address, social norms. It has to all come as a package. And in this respect, I want to agree also with Monica. That's precisely what I also found through writing this report, that most of the national adaptation plans and the NDCs, yes, they refer to gender often to the issue of participation, but then, as she also said, they talk of women and girls primarily as a vulnerable group. They do not refer to their agency, to their contribution, to their knowledge, and very few of them also have operationalized their plans. So in that sense, really, there is still a lot to go. I would say that we do still also have to do better in recognizing specific vulnerabilities, risks and barriers experienced by women, depending on their overlapping identities, and also depending on these long-standing structural models and systems of discrimination, exploitation, and exclusion that women face. Because, let's face it, women are discriminated against and experience violence not in a vacuum. That's because they live in societies and are part of systems and economies that are patriarchal and that discriminate against them in all ways of life, right? Political, economic, social, and so on. So really we have to, I know it's hard, but we will have to really dismantle these systems of exploitation of exploitation of and just move it to something more inclusive,
Yes.
more feminist, and more transformative.
Yes,
Yep.
thank you so much. Let's dismantle these systems. Thank you. Thank you so much, Reem. Raquel, what is the top priority for the UN and the UNDP to advocate gender equality?
So very difficult to talk about after the special rapporteur. I really connect with what she said. I think the priority is to institutions, is to understand very well how big democracies operate and to move from generalists to more gender expertise, scientific knowledge. We need also to, I agree with you, move from the concept of gender mainstreaming that is pretty ticking box or mechanistic to talk about integration, about connections, and do not take this superficially. It's a very, very complex problem. So for us, our priorities goes on this direction. We need long-term investments in ministries, in the actors, but as a system, as an ecosystem, cannot work only on institutions without not taking care of civil society. So there are many entry points. The Green cannot ignore women, and it should contribute to women's empowerment. We need more money, more women, more money, more accountability. Financing is so crucial, and of course we need more data. So it's a combination of, and it's a systemic approach, but for UNDP, definitely there is no one single shot or one silver bullet, because it's complex. And
more money, more women, more data.
Yep.
Well, we have the data up here, we have the women here, but what's missing from this room is the men and the financing. So let's bring them into this conversation. Thank you so much, Raquel. Monica. Monica, before we wrap up this exciting session, we must be aware that the global population today will pass 8 billion. There is, Monica, as you represent the Population Fund, there is some preconceived notions and stigmas about the narratives surrounding women and girls with our population surpassing 8 billion. What would you like to set clear with this narrative?
Well, first of all, it's a reason to celebrate. And I think it's so timely that the world population reaches 8 billion while we are here in COP, discussing how we can build a sustainable planet for people with prosperity, leaving one behind. So I think the time, it's really great. But I think, Sophie, it's a reason to celebrate. Reaching this milestone means that people are living longer, healthier lives. We can also celebrate the achievements on gender equality. Just look at how many women we have in this room. We can celebrate innovation and technology, the fact that we are here together, but we have people connecting by Zoom and watching us from other parts of the world. The fact that you can WhatsApp your friends just saying, what an amazing session I'm seeing on gender and human rights and climate change. So this is reasons to celebrate, but we need to acknowledge, as we've done throughout this morning already, that inequalities are spread and they are even deepening in some ways. Just look how many million of people are women and people are offline, or in developing countries don't have access to internet. Just look at what COVID did for inequality. It will take us 136 years to reach gender equality. 136 years, and climate change is going to make us setback on many of our transformative results, as you've mentioned. So the message today would be, if I can, to be very clear on the linkages between population dynamics, sustainable development, and climate change. Let me just say this in a way that it cannot be misread. An individual is not a unit of consumption or emissions. We are much more than that. Each one of us, 8 billion, are more than that. The regions in the world with the greatest emissions, the highest consumption patterns, and the largest carbon footprints are indeed the wealthiest nations. Many of them have populations that are stable or are in decline. However, nations with younger populations and relatively higher population growth also have the lowest rates of carbon emissions, the smallest footprint, and yet they bear the brunt of climate vulnerabilities and impact. What we cannot do is we cannot forget that we have in front of us 8 billion opportunities and possibilities to build a world with dignity. And no matter what's your starting point, no matter how you look at this data, these demographic trends, you cannot find your pathway by reducing women's sexual reproductive health and rights. That's not an option. What you need to do is increase the scope of rights, increase the scope of choices of your population, prepare for the dynamic demographic change that you're going to have, and with data, with sound public policies, build demographic resilience. Make this 8 billion of people, 8 billion of opportunities. That would be our clarion call. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Reem and Raquel, for all of your work. And let's just be clear, they're not fighting for just women and girls. They're fighting for entire humanity. The more that women and girls thrive, the more that our world, our natural world, our planetary world, and our human health thrives. Thank you all three so much. For our second fireside chat today, we turn to governments and grassroots experts for their perspectives on how to strengthen rights-based, gender-responsive, and integrated approaches in their efforts to advance climate action at NDCs. The speakers are, and I invite you to the stage now, the speakers are engineer Sara Alhaleeq, and I apologize if I mispronounce your name, Head of Adaptation Section, Directorate of Climate Change, Ministry of Environment, Jordan, Ms. Kathy Nian Jetnel Kajiner, Climate Change Envoy, Ministry of Environment, Climate Change Directorate, Republic of Marshall Islands. Welcome. Ms. Juliet Grace Luwedde, Uganda, African Youth Initiative on Climate Change, Regional Coordinator for East Africa. Ms. Fatou Jeng of UNGO, Gambia, and Ms. Aroe, Ajoeni, Climate Action, Malaysia. Welcome. Okay. Our question to the first speaker is to Ms. Sara, Ministry of Environment, Jordan. Jordan is one of the countries that has substantially integrated gender into NDCs. Sara, how do you plan to deliver on these efforts during implementation, especially seeing that NDCs don't provide budget lines for this work?
Thank you, Sophie. And please let me start by thanking UNFPA for inviting Jordan to participate in this. Let me tell you, I've been in climate change for 10 years, but this is one of the most excited sessions, and I learned a lot from the speeches from both ministers and the ladies from the previous session. Thank you for all the messages that you gave. You inspired us a lot, and I'm so sure that most of us will come back with this energy. So thank you. And getting back to the questions, just let me highlight the thing that, in generally speaking, when you need to implement something and you need to have successful outcomes, you need to better plan and to better understand the circumstances that you have. So for Jordan, we committed to address to address gender and gender equality in our commitments. It's a commitment that we need to have and we need to deliver. So for the UNFPA Convention and for the Paris Agreement. So when after Paris Agreement, the most significant commitment that we have is the NDCs. And NDCs was the NDCs gender and gender equality was addressed as an enabling factor for climate change, and we studied it as not something that we could make us back. It's something that we need to have to better implement our NDCs, and also for adaptation, national adaptation plan. We hopefully will be launched officially next month. This is the base for all adaptation efforts in Jordan, for all the future adaptation efforts. So, from planning to implementation, for us, for any as a country, one of the developing countries, we are focusing on adaptation. So when we have to implement a project, we should always link it to our NDCs and to our national adaptation plan. And for those both plans, this is the NDCs is the political base for the climate change, and the NAP is, as I said, is the future base for all adaptation. And when gender just have the weight that it really should be, for those documents, we try to link both with the implementing entity and the international community with what we have in those plans. So always we refer to NDCs and NAP as the wheel that we have to move forward for delivering our commitment to climate change. And as gender is really addressed there, so it's a commitment and we have to address it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. Ms. Kathy, Climate Change Envoy, Ministry of Environment, Climate Change Directorate of Marshall Islands. So working across various line ministries, can you elaborate how your government plans to implement more gender-responsive climate adaptation efforts with the corresponding budget lines?
Thank you. So in the Marshall Islands, we have something called the NDCP Deep Dive. And this is funding provided to the Marshall Islands through the UNDP. And what we've created are working groups for cross-cutting issues. And these working groups meet on a regular basis. And this is where we overview and we incorporate the Ministries of Internal Affairs, which works with women, and then women's organizations like Women United Together Marshall Islands, like the NGOs. And this is where they coordinate on gender-responsive plans. And I think it's this kind of communication and constant of meeting and discussing and implementation from the deep dive funds that allows us to ensure that that gender responsiveness is incorporated across our mitigation implementation and our adaptation implementation. So I think that's our best bet, and we also have financing provided by the UNDP deep dive funds that is just for gender and gender responsiveness. I think there's still a lot of room for growth, to be honest, but I think that's how initially we're thinking through those kinds of, we're ensuring that gender is prioritized in those realms. I think besides this, there was also a study provided by the NAP Global Network where they actually look through our mitigation and our adaptation plans to ensure and to highlight any of the gaps that could be seen. And so they provided this report for us. They worked with most of our ministries and across our different sectors. And they were also able to provide further guidance on the areas that we need to grow in. And so these are just a few of the examples that we have for how we're working through those kinds of situations, with incorporating gender into our adaptation and mitigation. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And as Reem mentioned on the earlier panel, financing is a huge part of this equation. Miss Juliet of Uganda. Hello down there. So young people today are stepping up to the challenge and calling on their governments to take climate action measures. And on these issues, youth leadership has never been more important. Etched in the Horn of Africa, Uganda has suffered a prolonged drought with devastating consequences. Juliet, Grace, how can youth on the ground be supported to provide locally led solutions? How can youth be supported? How can we support you?
Thank you very much. I think I'll start by reflecting on the previous panel. one of the speakers mentioned that one of the issues that we are facing today is systems and structure. So until the systems that we have in place are actually changed in a manner that allows for young people to see themselves in these systems and structures, it becomes hard for them to actually even innovate more, to even take more action. And I will use the example of Uganda, where I come from. And again, because the NDCs is one of those reflecting areas that we've been talking about, while we're revising our new NDCs that were submitted, young people were put at the center of this revision process. Our partners, plus my government, made sure that the young people were involved deeply in the revision process of our NDCs, because then they get to understand what the NDCs are all about, but then also how the work and the innovations that they are taking are reflected in those NDCs. But now, even while we are thinking about the implementation process of these new NDCs, young people now have to go a step higher to say, okay, we were consulted and our voices have been included in these new NDCs, then how do we implement? I did an analysis of the previous NDCs, and the word youth only appeared 3 times. Gender appeared 5 times, and women were clustered with the vulnerable groups. So that goes to show you that there are those little gaps that needed to be addressed. And in this new NDC that we have, the word youth appears 13 times, women appears 21 times, but this time around they are not clustered as women and youth or the vulnerable. They've been given special attention within the NDC. So that's why structural process go a long way in terms of, okay, how do we see ourselves in the process and the work that we are doing? But again, structures are usually led by our leaders. So if our leaders themselves are not seeing themselves in these processes, it becomes very hard for them to, one, inspire us or even motivate us to take action. If I'm looking at my leaders and everything that they are doing or saying is not reflective of the kind of action they want me to take, there is no way I'm going to do anything about that.
Thank you so much, Ms. Juliet Grace. We have to see ourselves in the structures. So I thank you for being one of those people directly in the structures that people can look up to. Okay, so Ms. Fatou, hello down there. You were part of the youth reviewers that worked with UNFPA to review the updated NDCs on integration of gender and SRHR, among other priority areas. So Fatou, can you share with us one of the top findings from your assessment and your perspective on how young people can move this agenda forward?
Thank you so much for having us in this very important discussion. I believe we all understand, or we all know, the vulnerability of young people, women and girls, to the impacts of climate change, especially those from the global south. Over the years, we have been seeing how the impacts of climate change has been affecting our source of livelihood and our means of income. That is why today I came to COP with the youngest delegate, who is 6 weeks old, attending gender negotiations to remind our world leaders about the importance of investing in young people, the future generation, and women and girls who are mostly disproportionately impacted by the impacts of climate change, courtesy of the support of UNFPA. So the report that we did was able to look at gender, young people, and sexual reproductive health and rights, and its integration in our NDCs. However, what we were able to find out in our NDCs is countries are trying to ensure that they include young people in the development of the NDCs, that is by consulting them and also seeing the vulnerabilities of young people to the impacts of climate change. However, when it comes to supporting young people as that is financially, so that young people can be able to effectively adapt to the impacts of climate change through certain climate adaptation projects, among others, we're seeing that is quite limited as far as some of the countries or the countries that have reviewed are concerned. On the issue of sexual reproductive health and rights integration, it's quite sad to see that there is a significant gap in the NDCs, because among the countries that have actually reviewed, it was only one that I've seen that actually included sexual reproductive health and rights. And from where I come from, especially in the Gambia and other West African countries, we continue to see cases of sexual and gender-based violence on the increase. Mostly cases are actually even unreported. We see increase in maternal mortality, among other challenges that women and girls face. So the fact that we don't see sexual reproductive health and rights integrated in our nationally determined contribution is something that is quite sad. And I am really looking forward to seeing this included in our NDCs, because for us to tackle the climate crisis, we must tackle the gender inequality problems that we are facing so that we can at least see or ensure that loss and damage, climate financing, and climate justice is effectively implemented. On the issue of inclusion of young people in decision-making processes, I believe in all the discussions that we have been as far as issues of young people are concerned, we have seen young people calling for the need for their inclusion in decision-making processes. So in our NDCs, we could see that on the inclusion of youth in decision-making, it's quite limited. And that is why one of the recommendations that have been made as far as the NDCs are concerned is seeing the need for the increase people in climate decision-making processes, because it is these young people that are actually in the field most of the time, working with frontline communities, working with vulnerable communities. So getting these young people in decision-making processes will help us to ensure that the voices of the most marginalized and the most affected are included in the decision-making processes. In addition to that, we've also called for the issue of gender-sensitive and responsive climate adaptation projects, so that at least the projects that are implemented are localized. Even though we see funding, but communities most of the times do not see the funding. It just comes maybe most of the time through the government, but the NGOs that are working on these projects are not really sort of like included or supported. So the localization of funding for gender responsive and gender transformative action is really crucial as far as the implementation of our NDCs are concerned. And so I think but yeah, I hope I have more time to share something.
Thank you so much, Fatou. Include youth in your NDCs from the beginning. Thank you. Ms. Sara, you do a lot of work in convening women and gender activists, especially at the grassroots, on the intersectionality of action on gender, SRHR, and climate change. My question to you is, what is missing from this agenda at COP, and what do we need to implement?
Thanks for having me. We're all very far away from home, so I appreciate all of you for being here, and thanks for inviting me. So yesterday I met my country's delegation, the Malaysian delegation, and we were discussing a bit about public participation, and they told me that they don't have time to do consultations with everyone, and I think this is unacceptable. Everyone has the right to be consulted about their future, especially the young people, right? And when we talk about NDCs, we were talking about NDCs the whole time, and who's going to implement it? It's us, the people, the young people too, on the ground, right? And when they say they cannot consult everyone, that means that they cannot consult with everyone. More than 50% of the population in Malaysia are women. And how can we leave out this big chunk of the population, all of them not being represented, not being consulted? So women living in the global south, women living in developing countries, we depend on our land for resources, for our livelihood, for us to nurture our traditions and our cultures. And when these lands are polluted, when these lands are gone, when women are denied of their rights to cultivate their lands, when they cannot be financially independent because they have lost their lands, they cannot take care of their family and their children when disasters hit. So then their bodies shrink, this is threatening their sacred body and their sexual and reproductive rights as well. And their children face malnutrition. So when we talk about solution, the first thing we must do is we must uproot false solutions, because false solutions without safeguards, no procedural protection. In these false solutions too, there's a lot of missing gaps. There's a lot of leakages where human rights abuses can happen. And this part has to be strengthened by including women in public participation. Then we talk about finance again. We talk about the money again. So the money has to reach communities. When we talk about financing in the global south, in developing countries, this money has to reach women, leaders in their communities. It cannot just be something on paper. It has to reach the people on the ground. These are the women who organize themselves, who organize their community, and the people who organize their families. So we must get this money on the ground, and we must get the finance that they need. So please, never underestimate the power of young women, the power of young girls. They are a force to be reckoned with when they are empowered. And NDCs, without making an emphasis on education for young girls, is pretty much pointless. And just to wrap up, as we speak right now in Malaysia, it's pretty late right now, but as we speak, there's now 5,000 flood victims. Malaysia is underwater. And people, there's been around 5,000 people at this point, flood victims. And on top of that, our general elections is coming up in 4 days. And we are completely unprepared. And we know when disasters like this hit, who are the most impacted. When displacement happen, there's gender-based violence that skyrocket, even in rescue centers. And the man of the country will say, we will brace this flood together. But when you say together, who do you mean is together? And we cannot brace this together when half of the population are not represented in consultations. Thank you.
I am so moved and touched by each and every one of you. If you feel comfortable, I just want to quickly show how the youth can. Do you mind sharing your age? Because I just think that so many of us have so much life in front of us and are carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders at Sarkkinen. If you feel comfortable,
Let's start with yours.
I'm. How about you?
I am 23.
I'm 33. I'm 34.
27.
26.
Thank you. This is, I'm sorry if I made anyone uncomfortable. It was just to show that we have decades in front of us. We have 7 to 10 years until we already will be projected to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it's the youth and women that are carrying the weight for the rest of the world. Thank you all so much for your work. I'm so grateful. We are all so grateful. Thank you so much for representing your countries and your communities. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for moderating.
Thank you. For our third and final fireside chat today, we have a panel that will help us think about how to move from the conceptual to reality, meeting tangible solutions by accessing finance, strengthening partnerships, and building greater commitment on the road to COP28. We have Mr. John Dusabe-Richards, Director of Global Health at the IDRC. We have Dr. Raidan Abdulaz AlSaqqaf, apologies, PhD Development Coordinator, COP28, Office of the Resident Coordinator of Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. And we have Dana Elhassan, Principal Gender Specialist at the African Development Bank. Please join me on stage now. The IDRC has been of immense support to advancing research on climate impacts on health and SRHR. Mr. John Dusabe-Richards, Director of Global Health, IDRC, regretfully is unable to join with us in person and has shared a recorded video message that addresses why this agenda is so important and how IDRC is working to strengthen the evidence base at the global and national levels. Welcome.
Hello, my name is John Dusabe-Richards. I am the Director of Global Health at the International Development Research Centre, a Crown Corporation of Canada government. It's my pleasure to be with you here today to share IDRC's perspective on the interdependence between climate change and sexual and reproductive health and the rights of women and girls. I'll speak about 2 points. First, why IDRC believes that the voices and health needs of women and girls must be included in the climate change response. And second, what will IDRC prioritize in this area? On the first point, while everyone is affected by climate change, women and girls suffer disproportionately. Climate change-induced health emergencies and pandemics continue to be driven by human behavior and interactions between people, animals, and the environment. Given their important role on the economy, women are often at the heart of this intersection, putting their sexual, reproductive, and maternal health at risk. Women's inclusion in climate change decision-making is therefore obligatory. Their inclusion, for example, in national parliaments, leads to the adoption of more effective climate change policies and legislation. IDRC prioritizes including women. Last year, we launched the collaborative One Health Research Initiative on Epidemics. This initiative supports efforts to integrate gender considerations into local surveillance and data systems as part of preparedness and response to climate-sensitive epidemics. We have a great opportunity here at COP27 to promote SRH-sensitive climate responses, advocating for more attention in the nationally determined contributions and the climate action processes. On the second point, significant knowledge gaps exist about context-specific approaches for adapting to and mitigating climate change effects on health. And gaps exist on the benefits of including gender equality, sexual, reproductive, and maternal health in these approaches. IDRC will continue its focus on supporting the production of stronger local evidence on the root drivers that underpin climate change, facilitating responses, promoting gender equality, better sexual, reproductive, and maternal health outcomes. We strongly believe in this response and encourage other actors in search of evidence to not leave this aspect behind. Thank you on behalf of IDRC for inviting us to this side event.
Thank you to Mr. John of the IDRC. Okay, so my question goes out to Dr. Raidan. Am I pronouncing your name right?
Close enough.
Say, what is the proper? Raidan. Thank you. Dr. Raidan, you are actually our first male on this panel section, so what an honor to have you. So as the development coordinator for COP28 of Abu Dhabi for the UAE, how is COP28 ensuring that it delivers on this agenda for women and girls globally?
Well, thank you for having me on behalf of my gender. We're still at COP27 and we still have some way to go to COP28. So, yes, can I get closer? Okay, is this better? All right. So we're still at COP27. We still have some way to go for COP28. And COP27 ushers an era of implementation COPs as we finalize the rule book in COP26. But the key issue for implementation remains financing, and we're struggling with that. And the struggle is in the sense that, first of all, there is little money to go around. The world is trying to rebuild its healthcare systems after a pandemic. We're trying to rebuild our educational systems after years lost for many students around the world. Jobs and businesses are hurting, and we have hyperinflation. So there is a serious crunch, financial crunch, as 60% of countries are worried about their debt. So where is the money? And the money goes through big, big, heavy machineries that we have, like the multilateral development funds and the Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms. And the resources do not trickle down. We have no clear evidence that what we put in those funds actually makes it to the local communities where it's needed the most, where it doesn't make it where the most vulnerable and disenfranchised community members need it. I come from Yemen, and Yemen is the worst place on earth to be a woman, and that was before the war. And now you have a war, and then you have a triple crisis and the planetary crisis in terms of the impact of climate change. And the money that you put in doesn't make it. You don't see it on the ground. So we do have a critical issue here in terms of how do these machines work and how do they support, are they fit for purpose, and how can they deliver on that? And this is a key discussion item that's ongoing at COP27, have been going for quite some time, and I assume will continue to go with us as we go down the line. And as Monica mentioned in her intervention, she mentioned that there is an issue of vulnerability that we need to look around, and we need to focus those resources to where they are needed. And I can go on and on for that, on that.
Thank you, Dr. Raidan. There is still a huge gap between mitigation and adaptation finance. So Dana, this question is to you. Welcome. In particular, we do not see appropriate financing support going towards gender-sensitive adaptation. So Dana, how is the African Development Bank working to address this gap and ensuring that climate finance delivers and strengthens resilience to climate change for women and girls?
Thank you so much, and thank you to UNFPA for inviting us here. I think this is probably one of the first times for us to be on a panel such as this, and I think it comes at a time where it's necessary, and maybe we should have done this a long time ago. I want to just unpack a little bit the FAT, Multilateral Development Bank paradigm. Of course, as the African Development Bank, like the World Bank, Asian Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, we usually work through the government's ministries of finance. So I won't talk about that in this session. We also support women in the private sector and women who are heads of companies that are working in solar, in renewable energy projects, waste management, and so forth. So I'm not going to talk about that either. Women are not a homogeneous group, so we're specifically talking about the grassroots and the crisis that we have in terms of financing women at the community level. We are painfully aware, as the African Development Bank, of the lack of financing, and we are constantly lobbying for more adaptation funding at the global level. But let me just talk a little bit about the institutional level. So we have a very strong record of financing adaptation. We allocate 41% of all our projects to adaptation and mitigation. That amounts to about $1.5 billion a year to adaptation. And of course, in all our projects, we do the usual mainstreaming, pushing for targets, sex disaggregated data. But as we know, this is not enough. It's really just skimming the very top. It's usually what is easily accepted now. It's the norm, and you won't get much resistance. Where the resistance is at having targeted initiatives. And I mean, the fight or the struggle continues even internally within the institution. And I don't think the AFDB is any different to many other institutions but we are mainstreaming. Why do we need a targeted initiative? And then we have to go through that discussion and creating that theory of change, and similar to many other institutions, I think, that are struggling with this. But let me just talk very quickly about why there is that difficulty. And it does come from the fact that a lot of the targeted initiatives that we are trying to develop at the bank to reach the community level are what are considered low yield, or they don't produce enough economic benefits because it's not clear to see, right? We talk about productive potential of women and girls, but it's not we're not easily able to calculate or financialize the benefits. But that doesn't mean to say that we should stop there. We have had some successes. We're trying to build a case, even internally. We've had some support from the Global Affairs Canada, the feminist government at the moment, so they're really helping us to push. We had a small call for proposal for about $7 million within the bank. That was, again, like as I said, funded by the Canadians. And we were inundated by civil society organizations on the continent that wanted some of that financing to implement projects on the local level. So we proved the need. right? We talk about need, but then how do you calculate that? We have a number now. We were able to finance projects with that, and we were able to see that actually, if you open a little bit that financing space, there are actors that can act on that level, and they may not be the very grassroots, because also grassroots is, again, not homogeneous. What are you really talking about? We were able to at least hit those civil society organizations that can function at about $1 million and just below. We then also got more support from the Global Affairs Canada and our own financing for $100 million as loans to public and private sector projects that are promoting climate change and gender equality. There are also other sources of financing that we all know, GSF, JEF, the climate investment funds. At the bank, we also have the Korean and the Japanese funds also helping us to implement gender equality and climate change. I will maybe talk about our most recent project because in recognition of the government of Zimbabwe here, our most recent project is one that was developed as a result of the COP15 meetings that happened in Abidjan this year. And I think it was interesting for us as the African Development Bank to move beyond just talking about climate change and actually now look at climate change effects, which, and in this regard, we looked at specifically drought. And so I think there was the Gender Caucus meeting there that happened during the COP15 that meant that we saw Zimbabwe, Madagascar, and Mozambique drought strategies being evaluated from a gender perspective. And so we were able to draft a proposal with them and get funding for about $2 million to look at how we help those governments in ensuring that the linkages between drought and gender equality are mitigated and supported. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dana. My last question to each of you, Dr. Raidan and Dana, is a phrase or a sentence is what role do each of us play in ensuring that gender equality is on the agenda leading up to COP28?
From a financing point of view, I think, so the COP28 seems like it's going to be very different to the COP27, just from the location and from the focus. I think because the COP is in Egypt right now, there is this discussion on adaptation that maybe next year the focus will shift a little bit to looking more towards mitigation. So I think we have to prepare for that, and we have to look at gender not from an adaptation point of view, but from a mitigation point of view. And at the African Development Bank, we're already preparing for that by trying to study gender and carbon credits. We're looking at gender and ESG. And of course, all the work on adaptation will continue. Maybe it will not be at the COP28 discussions, but I think it's important for us to always occupy all spaces. There should be no discussion in any room anywhere where gender is not being raised.
Yes, thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Raidan?
So COPs are a continuous process. Every COP builds and continues where the previous COP ended. And this COP, yes, thank you. So COPs is a continuous process. Each COP has to build on the previous one. So we need to see what are the successes and progress that we made so far in order to build on it. But one thing we can look forward to is the global stocktake in COP28, because that gives us a scorecard in terms of the progress that we have done. And it also gives us an opportunity to provide some insights on transparency, on accountability, on budget tagging, making sure that the projects that you have, all projects for all multilateral development banks, include some clear gender markers, some scorecards that show this investment have contributed to advancing gender equality. This investment in adaptation had a view to ensure that we're advancing on this argument. And one key issue to keep an eye for is the issue of financing. 5 to 6% in total of all financing for climate on the table is grants. The rest is loans, concessional loans, and a variety of other instruments. And when we look at that, how many of those proposals actually have the help required so that the civil society organization who apply for the Canadian funding have the capability to put together a proper proposal. What Dr. Mahideen mentions in terms of developmental projects. So we need to make sure that there are some grants that go for local women-led organizations to make sure that these organizations are able to put together a proposal in the first place to access all the funding that we have. I think we need to see a little bit more on that.
Thank you, Dr. Raidan. It goes again back to the financing. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raidan. Thank you, Dana, so much for your work. And we look forward to seeing you next year. And you as well, Dana, for having gender equality on the agenda. Thank you so much. Thank you. Wow. Whew. Okay, what a session it has been today. We have heard from a diverse range of incredible speakers during each fireside chat, and it is clear that while concrete efforts are being made across the board, as a collective, we all have more to do. Allow me to underscore a few of the critical points that have been highlighted today. So, we know that climate change disproportionately threatens the most vulnerable women and girls and has detrimental effects on SRHR. We also know that true climate justice is not possible without considering gender equality. And true gender equality is only possible when the sexual and reproductive health and rights of women are fully realized. Climate justice is reproductive justice. We also know that we need 50% of climate financing to go towards climate adaptation, including towards adaptation strategies that are specifically dedicated to women and girls, as Dr. Raidan was saying on the last panel. Finally, we have seen that we must invest in research to fill evidence gaps related to gender, the needs of women and girls, and their health and rights. And this evidence must inform decision-making at every level. Further, women and girls must be around those decision-making tables, as we saw with Fireside Chat 2, when it comes to national climate policy, particularly gender-responsive adaptation efforts that directly impact our well-being. We must promote gender-transformative climate action by addressing the linkages between climate change and gender, including SRHR across climate action processes. And we must set and meet targets for inclusive, gender-balanced, multi-sectoral stakeholder participation in climate policy and action. Today, this panel was so meaningful for all of us, especially with the current world events. I'm especially, and we are all especially holding close to our hearts, from Iranian women still fighting for their basic rights to women in the US fighting for reproductive rights. We can no longer allow the same systems that exacerbate climate change and our planetary health to dictate our own choices and survival. Having choices, having a multitude of choices, that is true sustainability and a basic human right. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement today. Thank you. It is now my great pleasure to invite Her Excellency Rachel Ruto, the First Lady of Kenya, a champion of women's rights and equality, to offer some closing remarks, including her personal commitments to upholding the rights of women and girls in the context of the climate crisis. We will hear from the First Lady now. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, the discussions held over the past hour and a half have been fruitful and invigorating on a topic of great importance: enhancing climate action through rights-based and gender-responsive integrated approach. Let me thank the organizers and the panelists for eloquently elaborating the gender and human rights gaps that continue to persist and elucidating on the opportunities for better integration in the wake of a climate crisis that requires even more concerted efforts. There is no doubt, as we have heard today, that climate change is one of the greatest threats to human rights of our generation, posing a serious risk to the fundamental rights to life, health, food, and an adequate standard of living of individuals and communities across the world. There is also no doubt that climate crisis is not gender neutral. Women and girls experience the greatest impacts of climate change, which amplifies existing gender inequalities and poses unique threats to their livelihoods, health, and safety. My country, Kenya, is facing one of the worst droughts that has left 4.3 million severely affected, most of whom are women and children who suffer from food and water insecurity, livelihood loss. But Kenya is not unique. Climate events have been recorded all around the globe with devastating impact on humanity and the ecosystems, natural resources, and physical infrastructure upon which they depend. Let me therefore lend my voice to this discourse as we wind down today's event. I wish to emphasize 3 key messages for which we have heard from practitioners today. First, a people-centered, gender-responsive approach to climate policy is paramount to ensure human rights impacts and implications are addressed and that the most marginalized and vulnerable are protected and supported in climate change mitigation and adaptation. To do so, we must be deliberate to collect differentiated data on the impacts of climate change, which provides critical evidence to inform policy and that climate investment is better targeted. Second is the need to involve more women in addressing the climate crisis. Women are powerful agents of change and sources of solutions for solving the climate crisis. I have witnessed this myself as I have worked on women's economic empowerment for decades now. This is why all proposals shared today on how to better enable women through financing, policy, capacity building, amongst others, are critical issues we must take forward and with urgency. Finally, is a lesson drawn from the African philosophy of Ubuntu, a reminder that we are one. As the world converges here in Egypt, we are reminded that we are indeed interconnected and that together we can co-create a more sustainable world for current and future generations. May the partnerships forged extend good tidings to all those who are not able to be here so that the time we have spent engaging will translate to positive outcomes for all. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, First Lady Rachel Ruto. Thank you, everyone.